to this beautiful Sunday morning. I think most of you know me, but some of you who don't, my name is Ayush, and I'll be sharing the satsang with you today. As Zenia mentioned to me that, you're going to take this week's satsang, so I was thinking about the topic, what should we talk about? And I think Swamiji sent me this thought saying that, let's talk about the Hindu way of awakening, the inner significance behind worship and the symbols in the Hindu tradition. And I think it was for two reasons. One is, of course, the fact we're in the middle of Ganesh season and we are surrounded by such beautiful symbols and images and worship. So it's very important for us as yogis to understand what is really behind that symbolism. And secondly, very interestingly, just last week, my mom was talking to me over the dinner table, and she was reminiscing about her conversations with a few relatives, and they were discussing how the young generation today is simply not interested in outward puja, in all the rituals that are typically associated with the Hindu tradition, and she was saying, well, the kids are interested only to the extent that it's an occasion for them to party or to enjoy, but not really sort of doing the practices as they have been practiced for so long. And she was sort of feeling sad that, maybe in a generation or two, what will happen? Will there really be any interest in any of these traditions? And that really got me thinking. I was just wondering, well, why is that the case? And what is the reason why we're seeing this change in the consciousness, seeing the change in the way we express our devotion? Now, of course, for yogis, we have this understanding that the devotion is an inner devotion more than an outward devotion. So, of course, there is the outward practice, but we recognize that we want to go more inward. But if you look at just general people, for them, if you just tell them, okay, just do this because it is supposed to be done, very few people now want to do something because it's just supposed to be done. They want to know why. They want to have the experience. So it's really, the world is sort of changing towards this behavior of experience being rated higher than dogma. And so when you and again, when you really think about why, the answer actually starts becoming very obvious, is the yoga cycle. I think, are most of you familiar with the yoga's cycle in some shape or form? I think so. Maybe just I'll quickly mention it. This was a framework that was presented by Yukteswarji, who's Yoganandaji's guru, saying that the planet essentially goes through the cycle of 24,000 years. And it's a continuous cycle, and the cycle essentially means that it starts at a high level of consciousness, high level of spiritual evolution throughout the planet, and then it descends into a lower level of consciousness, and then it rises back up again. The normal traditional way of thinking about the planet is, the very Adam Smith type concept, where man sort of, really evolved from monkeys and then became a caveman and then sort of just kept going up like that. It's a very linear way of thinking, but in fact, if you think about that, it's actually quite a depressing thought if you look around and you think that this is the highest that we've attained, after millions of years of evolution. It's a pretty sad thought. So the good thing is that Yukteswarji actually clarifies that. He says that no, it's not a linear progression. It's actually a cyclical progression, and which means that there have been much higher states of spiritual evolution. In fact, also material evolution, technology, everything in the past. And currently, Yukteswarji clarifies that we are actually coming out of Kali Yuga, and we've actually just entered Dwapara Yuga, which is the sort of age of energy. And when you think of the yoga's framework and all the things that we're talking about the Hindu symbolism, Swamiji in fact clarifies that the reason why we have so much symbolism in the Hindu tradition is because the yogis or the rishis, when they had access to, in the higher ages, when they had access to these higher spiritual truths, they knew that Kali Yuga is coming. They knew that the darker ages are coming. Hence, it was very important for them to cloak or really hide the spiritual truths within symbols, within imagery, within allegories. Because if it is actually presented in the way it was, there's a high potential it becomes profane, or there's a very high potential that it actually gets misused. So in order to protect the sanctity of that spiritual truth, they had to cloak it in, symbolism and imagery. And in fact, and the idea was that the people of higher spiritual development will be able to see through that imagery to see what's actually really behind. And in fact, and as the age emerges and starts rising again, then the right time will then come for that imagery to essentially be interpreted and presented again. So we find ourselves now in the age where in rising Dwapara Yuga, we actually have a lot of the inner meanings coming out, which is why in fact the Bhagavad Gita as well, Lahiri Mahasaya was in fact the first person to translate and present the Bhagavad Gita in terms of the allegory behind it. And I think you're familiar with that. So, so you sort of start then thinking, well, okay, great. So Kali Yuga thinking is essentially, I just want to do outward worship, and I just want, kind of to be told what to do. But the Dwapara Yuga way of worship is to see, okay, well, what's behind, and particularly to unuse that understanding for our spiritual development. I think that is what is absolutely key. So, of course, what I'm going to talk about is a few of the traditions or the symbols that we see in the Hindu tradition. But before we do that, very important to understand this sort of distinction between what we call as Hinduism and what Swamiji in fact defines as Sanatan Dharma. Hinduism, in fact, as a name actually didn't really exist till a few hundred years ago. It is in fact, I think the British who actually applied that name onto what they saw when they came to India. But in India, it is never really called Hinduism. It is just essentially Sanatan Dharma. And when we talk about religion, we sort of tend to associate religion with outward practices, social behavior, all of those kind of things. But what Sanatan Dharma is essentially concerned with is essentially absolute truth, is essentially, and it's Sanatan Dharma is essentially presenting a way of awakening for the soul to those absolute truths. And Swamiji, in fact, in this book, and I just want to mention, this is the book that Swamiji wrote, The Hindu Way of Awakening. It's a really wonderful book, for those of you who are inspired to read more. So in that book, he actually says that Sanatan Dharma essentially has only two objectives, two main objectives. So the two main objectives are, one, for the upliftment of human consciousness, and the second one is the breaking of this self-identity, the egoic self-identity, and expanding that self-identity through love. So whenever we look at any of these symbols or any of these things, it's very important that we see it through that lens. How is that symbol uplifting my consciousness, and how is it actually breaking my self-identity? How is it expanding my self-identity? So what are the symbols that we actually see? So one of the symbols, of course, we go to a temple, and very interestingly, if you see traditional temples, they were beautifully decorated from the outside, and very, very intricate work and beautiful imagery. And the way it's explained is, Swamiji says that is actually illustrating the endless complexity and the fascination of the outside world, because the outside essentially is, sort of beautifully done. But when you go inside the temple, it's actually very simple. And hence this is the distinction that is drawn from that imagery, that the outside world can be infinitely complex, but the spiritual path is actually very, very simple. In fact, Swamiji writes in his songs, which is just a beautiful set of lines, and I just want to share that. He says, the path to perfection is narrow and steep. The bypaths are many, the pitfalls are deep. Okay, and so just reflect on that, think about that, and that's a very that's an interesting symbol that we get. In fact, the other way to look at a temple is also the temple is an allegory of the human body. So when we say that, okay, we go inside the temple and the deity or the idol is in the center of the temple, that is an allegory that we have to actually go inside ourselves, which is why Jesus also, when he says in his teachings that why look here or look there, the kingdom of God is within you, so, and that is the allegory that is presented there. So of course, when we go inside the temple, we have the deity, usually it's an idol, it could be a photograph, and in the Hindu tradition, I mean, you could go to so many different temples and you would just see so many different images, many of them very abstract, you don't really understand them. And of course, I think all of us in this room have grown familiar, we've grown up with that. So we've sort of seen it, so it doesn't look unusual to us because we've seen it since childhood. But for people who come from outside, when they go to a Hindu temple and they see the idol, they sort of wonder, what is there's a half elephant and half man. There is someone sitting on a lotus. There is someone sitting on a swan. What is going on? And it's very difficult for them to understand that. And the way Swamiji explains is that the reason why we have so much complex imagery in many of the idols and the images is because the rishis had to present to us many abstractions, and it's very difficult for the mind to grasp abstractions. So if the rishis wanted to explain to us infinity, how do you explain infinity, as a concept to someone who doesn't understand it? So hence they had to use an abstraction, and hence they would use a symbol of the sea, for example. So if you say, okay, if you visualize the sea and you look at the horizon, you can sort of get a glimpse of what infinity is like. And of course, many of these symbols or idols, etc., that we have, the images, were actually deep inner realizations of the rishis, which they had to present to us in a way that we could actually understand. As I say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Right? So instead of describing all of those things in detail, they actually present it to us as an image. And often many of these images had multiple facets to it. There were multiple dimensions, like a diamond, right? I mean, a diamond has multiple facets. So in order to understand that, you actually give it through an image. So let's look at, because we're in Ganesh season, let's look at the image of Ganesh, right? And it's something that we all love and something we've all sort of adored. And well, what's behind that? So of course, he's sort of got the head of an elephant, and elephant symbolizes wisdom. And there's a saying, right? As wise as an elephant. At the same time, the elephant also symbolizes strength. So Swamiji explains that when you want to break through the jungles of delusion, or when you want to break through the jungles of troubles, essentially, if an elephant is walking through a jungle, there's nothing to stop him. No matter what tree, nothing. It's just the power of the power that he has. He essentially just powers through that jungle and breaks all the trees, all the things. He basically creates his own path. And very interestingly, if you look at the juxtaposition, Ganesh's vehicle, if you like, is what? Is a rat, is a mouse, yeah. And so you think about the contrast, and we've all heard these rat and elephant stories, right? Where, the little rat is sort of talking to the elephant. And the reason why we had those stories is because the clear juxtaposition of it, right? I mean, that's how different are the two. Yet, for Ganesh, his vehicle is the rat. And Swamiji explains that why is that the case? Is because, again, when you want to get through troubles, either you can actually be like an elephant and power through the troubles, or you can be like the rat and actually dig underground through the jungle and burrow through the jungle and get to the other side through that. So essentially, and Ganesh, of course, represents is a symbol of removing obstacles. Vigna harta, as they say, right? And when we go to Ganesh, that is the first thing that we say. Every time we start worship, etc., is that remove all the obstacles from my path. And what Swamiji essentially is explaining, that the symbol of use. So essentially, if we want to remove obstacles from our path, yes, we worship Ganesh, but we have to actually worship the ideals behind Ganesh. Essentially, we have to have wisdom, we have to have power and courage, and at the same time, we have to have subtlety also. Subtlety. So it's just this combination of all of those factors. And hence, when we're talking about worshipping an idol, it's not really worshipping the idol per se, it's actually worshipping the ideal which is actually behind that idol. So whenever we're actually worshipping, it's very, very important for us to really imbibe and absorb that, okay, what is the ideal that idol is really representing, and how can I actually sort of draw that quality from that particular image or from that particular photo into my consciousness. And this goes back to the root point. The purpose of Sanatan Dharma is to actually raise and uplift our consciousness, and hence all of those qualities are essentially going to help us to do that. And of course, it's not all very abstract. Well, it is abstract, but it's meant for us to understand. But the idol or the image or the photograph, there is divine power there also. As Lahiri Mahasaya writes in he told one of his disciples, when one of his woman chelas, she asked him for his photograph, and he gave her his photograph, and he said that this is a photo if you deem it is a photo, but it is divine protection if you deem it is protection. So there is real power in these images if we believe that there is power in them, right? In the same way, there is another great story about Master going to the Dakshineshwar temple. So the name of the chapter is called The Heart of a Stone Image. Okay, now just think about just the name of that chapter, right? The Heart of a Stone Image, which means that the stone image actually has a real consciousness, a real heart behind it. And when, of course, Master goes to the Dakshineshwar temple and he prays, and in fact he says he went to that temple also because Ramakrishna Paramhans, when he used to pray in that temple, the Divine Mother Kali used to come alive, to him. And so Master said, and he went to pray for his brother-in-law. And after sitting there for many hours, Divine Mother didn't respond to him. Divine Mother was still the idol. And then as he was getting up, Divine Mother actually came alive. And I just want to read a few lines from the autobiography because it's just so beautifully written. So this is Master talking to the Divine Mother just as he's finished his long meditation in the Dakshineshwar temple, and the mother has not answered his prayers yet. So Master writes, Divine Mother, I silently remonstrated, Thou didst not come to me in vision, and now thou art hidden in the temple behind closed doors. I wanted to offer a special prayer to thee today on behalf of my brother-in-law. And then Master writes, my inward petition was instantly acknowledged. First, a delightful cold wave descended over my back and under my feet, banishing all discomfort. Then, to my amazement, the temple became greatly magnified. Its large door slowly opened, revealing the stone figure of Goddess Kali. Gradually, it changed into a living form, smilingly nodding in greeting, thrilling me with joy indescribable. As if by a mystic syringe, the breath was withdrawn from my lungs. My body became very still, though not inert. And then he writes, sometimes it is a test by God to delay the fulfillment of prayers, but he eventually appears to the persistent devotee in whatever form he holds dear. A devout Christian sees Jesus, a Hindu beholds Krishna or Goddess Kali, or an expanding light if his worship takes an impersonal turn. Spiritual sight, X-ray-like, penetrates into all matter. The divine eye is center everywhere and circumference nowhere. I realized anew, standing there in the sunny courtyard, that when man ceases to be a prodigal child of God, engrossed in the physical world, indeed dream, baseless as a bubble, he re-inherits his eternal realms. And I just love how Master calls this world. He says, a physical world, indeed dream, baseless as a bubble. He says he re-inherits his eternal realms. Now, of course, when you see in our own ceremonies that we have, the Kriya ceremony, the discipleship ceremony, there's so many symbols that we essentially offer. So the symbol of a flower when we offer in our discipleship ceremony, Swamiji explains that is a symbol of devotional self-offering to the Lord. When we're offering the fruit in our Kriya ceremony, that is an offering of our past karma that we're giving to the Lord. When we're offering our when we do the Aarti, for example, the Aarti, in fact, is very interesting. The Aarti, how do we do the Aarti? It's sort of this circular motion and we take the light. So what Swamiji explains is that, in fact, the real Aarti is actually the inner fire, right? That's what he calls it. So he says the practice of Kriya Yoga essentially is taking energy and moving it up and down the spine in that same movement. So he says, again, the Aarti that we do is a symbolic representation of the inner fire, right, that we essentially offer, to the Lord. Now, it's very interesting that when we understand many of these inner symbols, right, and understand the real significance of the spiritual path, it's very easy to also get judgmental about what other people are doing, or the average person is doing. So you sort of have a little bit of this condescending attitude. Oh, I know, what this real thing is. The Aarti is not really an Aarti. Aarti is really, I know I'm doing the real Aarti with my Kriya Yoga. And sometimes that delusion can also come in. And in fact, interestingly, Master, when he was a young boy and he left his guru's ashram to look for Ram Gopal Mazumdar, you remember that story? And he goes past Tarakeshwar and he doesn't bow to the image at Tarakeshwar. And because he doesn't bow to that image, and then he goes on from there, he actually gets misguided and he gets lost. And then finally, he after a day of wandering around, he finally meets Ram Gopal Mazumdar. And Ram Gopal Mazumdar knows why that has actually happened. So he effectively reprimands Master. And I just want to read again just a few lines from there. So this is Ram Gopal Mazumdar now talking to Master just as after Master has wandered all around after while he was searching for him. So Ram Gopal says, "Tell me, where do you think God is?" And Master replies, "Why, he is within me and everywhere." I doubtless looked as bewildered as I felt. "All pervading, eh?" the saint chuckled. "Then why, young sir, did you fail to bow before the infinite in the stone symbol at the Tarakeshwar temple today? Your pride caused you the punishment of being misdirected by the passerby who was not bothered by the fine distinctions of left and right. Today too you have had a fairly uncomfortable time of it." And then Ram Gopal Mazumdar then sort of softens, and then he explains to Master. He says, "The devotee inclines to think that his path to God is the only way," he said. "Yoga, through which divinity is found within, is doubtless the highest road. So Lahiri Mahasaya has told us. But discovering the Lord within, we soon perceive him without. Holy shrines at Tarakeshwar and elsewhere are rightly venerated as nuclear centers of spiritual power." So it helps us to understand that. So, when we go to pilgrimage, for example, there is a real power in those, in the pilgrimage places, which is the reason why we go there. And the reason why that power is there is because firstly, the saints have sanctified those places. And secondly, because the collective devotional energy that has actually been applied there over perhaps centuries has actually generated that kind of spiritual vibration and power. So for example, again in the Hindu tradition, there is this tradition to go to Allahabad and take a dip in the Ganges and the Yamuna. And of course, the saying is that, well, if you go there, all your karmas are essentially washed away. And Master used to have a very interesting story where he would say, yes, when you go and you take a dip in the Ganges, yes, your karmas are washed away, but your karmas disappear. But what he said is that they actually jump away from you and sit on the trees on the banks of the Ganga. And then once you walk out of the Ganga, they jump back from the trees onto you. So again, it's important to think about these things both in the outer way and the inner way. And yes, there is spiritual power at those places. So, if those traditions are there, they are there for a reason. But it's important to understand what is the inner significance of that. So why Allahabad? Allahabad is, of course, they call that the Triveni junction, right? Where the Ganga and the Yamuna and then Saraswati, which is the hidden river, which is flowing underneath, so-called. It's the confluence of those three. In fact, the inner science behind that, or the reason behind that, is the Ganga and the Yamuna essentially are the Ida and the Pingala. The two nadis that we have, and the Sushumna essentially the third, the hidden nadi, if you like, and the confluence of all of those nadis essentially here, the point between the eyebrows. So when we essentially bathe here, that is when our real karma gets worked out, and this is why when we practice Kriya Yoga, we've practiced Kriya, we've raised energy here to the point between the eyebrows. Essentially we're bathing in that light here, the point between the eyebrows, and that is working out our karma. So it's important to think of both the outer as well as the inner. Now, of course, not only in religion are there symbols, but there are symbols everywhere when you look around it. As Swamiji writes very beautifully, he says a painting illustrates, or rather projects, the consciousness of the painter, right? The painting is exhibiting the consciousness of the painter. In the same way, the creation is a painting of the Lord, and creation essentially is illustrating or hinting at the consciousness of the Lord. Now, it is really up to us to actually see those different symbols and to be able to sort of identify them. So, Master says, for example, the sun represents wisdom. In fact, Swamiji recommended as a practice early in the morning, the first sunshine. He said, if you look at the sun at a time when it's not harmful to the eye, he said that is a great way to absorb wisdom. And Swamiji said a lot of wisdom came to him from that practice. Just a few minutes looking at the sun as soon as just as it's on the horizon. The moon represents love. So meditating on the moon, looking at the moon, he said you can actually imbibe that quality. The rain represents divine compassion. The flowers represent, joy and a certain tenderness and a fragrance, and that's just hinting, Divine Mother's hinting to us that is how we should be. We should be ever joyful, we should be fragrant. And if you take a flower and you crush it, right, what happens? It still emits, in fact, it emits even more fragrance. And that is yet another hint. It's like when we get crushed by, the people who we love, or by, people in the world, you still have to emit that fragrance of love. You still have to demonstrate that you care about that person. And at the same time, when principles are at stake, when you see nature in its fury, you see lightning, or you see earthquakes or floods, so where nature has that powerful force as well. And that is telling us that when divine principles are at stake, we ought to be also firm. We also have to have that sense of dharmic responsibility, that I will not bend, or I will essentially demonstrate a certain amount of power when dharma is concerned. And I'll just end with this last story of Master and Swamiji. When so Master asked Swamiji this question. So he used to call him Walter. So Walter, why do you think the planets stay in orbit around the sun? Why don't they just float off into space? So Swamiji said, well, of course, because it's the gravitational pull of the sun. And then Master asked him, well, if the gravitational pull of the sun is there, then why don't the planets get sucked into the sun and not, why do they still remain in orbit? He said, well, that's obvious. He said the centrifugal force of the rotation of, the planets holds them in place. And then Master sort of just went quiet. He didn't say anything. So Swamiji is all very confused. This is very early days, right? So Swamiji is all confused. Why is Master asking me all these scientific questions? And, what is the meaning behind them? And then he, of course, meditated on that, reflected on that. And a few weeks later, he realized that Master was actually giving him a direct a teaching, and essentially saying that the sun's gravitational pull essentially is the love of God. The Lord is constantly pulling us towards Him, and essentially gravity is a reflection of that. It's the reflection of that divine love. But the reason why we don't get sucked into that is because we are spinning with our own egoic desires. This whole baseless as a bubble that Master called this world, in that bubble we're constantly spinning with our desires, and hence we don't get sucked into that love. So as a devotee, as a disciple, if our goal is to find God, then it's very important we learn from these images and say, well, what do I want? Do I want to keep spinning in my desires, or do I essentially want to surrender, and do I want to go into the divine love? So that is something that helps us to think. So thank you very much.